start the stream first. That up. Finish with France. Okay. Any questions from you guys before we start? Okay. So, um, we ended with France last time. Normally I'd finish off with the Dutch, but we didn't quite have the time for that, which is fine. The Dutch don't have a whole lot going on. And then we're going to get into England, which is a lot. So, yeah, let's just move right along. Um, so yeah, as I said, the Dutch got involved. Um, they got involved with the Protestant Reformation like right away, in particular Calvinism. Um, declared their independence from Spain in 1581, and by 1600, they were a haven for all sorts of different Protestant sects from around Europe, as well as a major trading hub. So similar to Portugal, while not being like a huge land power in Europe, they were in the perfect place to be a major, like, international, um, really an empire, due to their ability to get out on the ocean and express their power that way. They had the Dutch East India Company, which I think predated the English East India Company, or the British East India Company, which um, we'll talk about a little bit in this class. It's more of a big deal in my European history class because they like essentially took over India, like this one company. Caused lots of issues. Um, Established a trading center on the Hudson River, present-day New York, where the Iroquois and other tribes for beaver skins. So they attempted friendly relations early on, um, especially with the Mohawk Nation, which was especially powerful because they didn't want unnecessary conflict, which, fair. Um, they moved their trading post to Fort Orange, which is in modern-day Albany. And quick aside, this we'll get more into a little bit later when we talk about the Glorious Revolution, but in the Netherlands, during this time of like Protestant revolt against Catholic Spain, there was a fellow leading a lot of the military, a guy called William, who happened to be from the province of Orange, so he was called William of Orange. He There wasn't a king in the Netherlands, but he was the closest thing to it. Like, he was their George Washington. Everybody was just like, yeah, this is our guy. He was just sort of their default leader, because he was just so good at what he did. So that's what the fort's named after. Also, later on, he becomes King of England. Middle. We'll get into that later. But the reason I bring that up is between the British Empire and the Dutch Empire and their spread all over the world, to honor William of Orange, they encouraged their farmers to only plant orange carrots. Not making that up. Since carrots are a root vegetable, they come in all sorts of colors. There's white carrots and like purple carrots and all sorts of stuff, which are still a thing, but because of this happening in the 1600s, we have like 400 years of most people were planting orange carrots, and that just sort of became the norm. So that's why that's the thing. Just so you know. No, that's not going to be on the test, but I just find that interesting. Something you probably wouldn't have known otherwise. So, they established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, which they purchased from the Lenape natives to protect ships from the English and French, because while the English and Dutch were working together to some degree, there was always trade wars and whatnot. And while the colony of the New Netherlands was based on religious toleration, there was still tension between the settlers and the natives that were already there, because, well, if you're going to be a farmer, you need land, and if you're carving up land when people are already living there, you're going to piss off the people living there. That's just how it works. If you show up, in a neighborhood that already exists and just start like living on people's front lawn, they're going to be unhappy about that. I mean, much less you show up in their living room and start like planting vegetables. Also, they roam their cows and pigs, which, if you're not familiar with how livestock treats crops, not well, especially pigs. Pigs are very destructive when it comes to pretty much any kind of plant. So this resulted in a lot of the cows and pigs getting killed by the natives, which, to be fair, like, now they've got pork and beef in return for their crops that they got destroyed. So, this led to about 20 years of sporadic on and off warfare between the natives and the Dutch. The Algonquin natives were eventually defeated. Still, though, the Dutch never went full, like, Spanish on the natives, or as we're going to see later on, even some of the English were almost as bad as the Spanish. Maintained decent relations with the Mohawk, but these tribes knew that once the beaver pelts ran out, the Dutch would no longer see them as a valuable ally and more as a nuisance that was in the way. So they were always very cautious in their dealings with the Dutch. This never really came to a head, though. By 1664, public opinion had turned against colonization. They had gotten tired of the 20 years of constant war. Weird how that works. And by the time the English rolled in to attempt to fight the Dutch for the land, the Dutch just let them have it. Like, yeah, we were on the way out anyway. We don't care. You can have it. So the English, quote, took over New Netherlands, which of course became New York, without having to fight for it, because the Dutch were on the way out. They weren't gonna die over this land that they were planning on leaving anyway. And again, there was sort of a weird on and off, good and bad relationship between the English and the Dutch. So it wasn't like the English and the French, where as soon as they see each other, they start shooting. So here is Fort Orange. I want to make note of the way the fort is constructed here with the palisades. I've got a better view of one here in just a minute. And that is in Manhattan. So you can see here the way these palisades come out in the sharp points on the unlike, say, a fort you'd see from, say, the Middle Ages where they were rounded. This is because, well, they've got cannons now, but also you're not going to attack these thick, heavy palisades because, if you were to breach it, you're not inside the main fort. You're still up here. So you're going to want to try to aim for these wide, flat parts. But if you go in like this, you've got overlapping fire from two of the palisades. You're getting hit by cannons on your flanks. I mean, and obviously, even just like going in, you're getting hit from both sides. So it was a very effective defensive structure. This was something that was developed in Europe during the Enlightenment by, I want to say the Dutch were the ones that first developed it, but then like everybody started using it because it was just so effective. And then obviously there would be guys up here with muskets and stuff to help out, but like the fact that a cannon could hit you when you're over here, but also another cannon could hit you from another direction, it was quite effective. Anyway, here's the Dutch, getting along with the Algonquins. Then I particularly enjoy this image where you've got the English are showing up in the port there, and it seems like everybody's getting ready to fight, but this guy has gotten a message, I'm assuming from the Dutch, that they're not fighting, they're turning it over to the English. And he doesn't seem happy about it, so I can do his hat down. He's angry, and everyone else is waiting for him to tell them to start fighting, but they're not going to. It's the whole thing. So yeah, that's pretty much the extent of the Dutch in North America, at least until we start getting just like immigrants coming over to settle in the English colonies. But this is pretty much the extent of their imperial push, I guess. So, on to the English, and of course we start with Jamestown. Obviously we had Roanoke, and that didn't work. Jamestown being the first one that stuck around, and there were a couple of reasons behind that. We don't just start with, and Jamestown was the thing. The English colonization shifted to the Joint Stock Company, which is a term you may have heard before, but you might not have been told what that was. I remember hearing that a bunch in high school, but they never told us what the hell it meant. Basically, before this point, if you invested in an overseas adventure, is really what it was, an overseas gamble of we're going to send a ship over to hopefully find gold or spices or whatever to make us some money, and then come back, and then whatever percentage you put into that trip, you get that percentage of the profit back. But if the ship disappeared or didn't make any money or whatever, if there was like a huge net loss, you didn't just lose whatever it was you put in, you had to pay for the percentage of that whole loss. And that would often result in people losing everything and going to debtor prison. So it resulted in a lot less people paying for these expeditions overseas because they didn't want to go to jail for it failing. So the Joint Stock Company basically if you put in, I don't know, $200, 200 British sterling pounds, um, into a venture, and it sailed off and just immediately exploded or something, I don't know. Cool, you lost your 200 British sterling pounds, but that was it. Because um, the other investors would buy their shares, and then the government would back the rest of it. So the government would also have money in it, and they would also be uh, willing to profit from it. But if it sunk, literally or figuratively, um, the government would back enough of it that you would only lose what you put in. So, the Virginia Company was one of the first ones, founded in 1606. King James I said that they could they were given access to all the land from what is present-day New York down to North Carolina, which, again, sure, he totally had, the right to do that, but whatever. These are monarchs in Europe. They do whatever they want. Now, the charter for the Virginia Company promised that the settlers would propagate the Christian religion, which is to say Protestantism, because, again, this is England. Well, specifically Anglicanism, it's the whole thing. But the real purpose was to make money, because A, this is England, and B, it's the Virginia Company, not the Anglican Church, sending these ships out. This is very different from, say, Spain sending out missionaries, or Jesuits in particular, or the French sending out, their like royal expeditions. These are specifically, I wouldn't say private companies because they were still tied in with the government, but government-backed companies as opposed to like royal expeditions. Anyway, 1607, they founded Jamestown in the mouth of the Chesapeake River. This was chosen for easy defense, and that was about the only thing it was good for. Jamestown sucked. It was a terrible place. It was swampy. If you're familiar at all with Virginia, which is not that far north from us, it's not that much better than here when it comes to humidity and swampiness and mosquitoes. And back then, mosquitoes weren't just annoying, they would kill you. They had all the fun diseases, malaria and yellow fever and whatever else. And people died by the dozens, because there weren't that many people. It would be by the hundreds, but there weren't more than 100 people. And also, because they were so close to the ocean, the water coming out of the Chesapeake Bay was tainted with the salt from the sea, so they couldn't even draw water from the river they were next to. They had to go way further inland just to get water, which is a nightmare in the freaking swamp. Yeah, and also, again, we're here in South Carolina, so it's not that hard to imagine. If you've ever been to the beach and ended up in like a marshy area and got hit by mosquitoes there, it feels like mosquitoes are meaner at the beach. Yeah, see, it feels like it's in your head, but all my other classes are like, yeah, no, that's just how it is. The mosquitoes are bigger and meaner at the beach. It's like something in that water just makes them angry. So yeah, they were dealing with like mega mosquitoes here in Virginia, and yeah, it was real bad. Also, they were idiots. They believed they were arriving in a place that like Cortez and Pizarro visited. They just come in and like steal gold and leave. So they spent all their time looking for precious metals and rubies and sapphire and whatnot, and didn't grow any crops. So by the time winter came, they were not at all ready. Also, I remember this from my time in undergrad. One of my professors made the point that like the people that came over were not necessarily nobility, but like aristocrats, um, and or aristocracy, I should say. And like the people they brought over weren't farmers or blacksmiths. They were like tailors and wig makers and like all the stuff that you would have for a fancy manor house and not surviving in the wilderness. And so when that first winter came and they ran out of food, um, to quote my professor, they ate the wig maker first because he wasn't exactly helping them survive, so he was the first to go. So as is often remembered, it was the natives that helped them survive. Chief Powhatan and his Powhatan Confederacy of about 14,000 Algonquin-speaking natives from 25 to 30 tribes, they would not have survived at all were it not for this huge confederacy that helped them out. Now, granted, they still lost like half of their population. Like it wasn't, oh well, the natives are here, so everything's cool. It was pretty much 50-50 whether you survived that winter. It was rough. So they sent in more people the next year, as well as a 7-year indentured servitude plan where like people had to work, which is probably a decent idea. The indentured servitude thing where you go in and you're kind of technically, basically enslaved for those 7 years, and then after those 7 years, you pay off whatever debt caused you to be an indentured servant, and then on paper at least, you would be given a plot of land and tools and enough money to get a small homestead started. Very rarely was that the case, but that's how it was supposed to work. Because most people couldn't afford the passage over from England to America. But work for 7 years and then you get a new start wasn't a horrible deal, usually. However, there was a severe dry spell which resulted in, of course, famine, and the natives also suffered severely from this because, there's not much you can do about all the plants are dying. And the people were, getting in the ships about to leave when a third supply convoy showed up to resupply the colony. Jamestown was very nearly another Roanoke. Not necessarily them just disappearing into the wilderness, but it very nearly was completely abandoned. So yeah, again, usually when you hear about Jamestown, it's like Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement, and then we just move on. Everything's fine. It was rough at the start, but then they move on. They were literally in the boats about to cast off when they saw the ships coming in to resupply them. So while this was going on, relations between the English and the natives were not the best, even though, the natives were keeping them alive. Because obviously the English, being the English, want to be on top, even if they're dying. And the natives understood what the Europeans represented, and wanted to use the power of the English, which is to say their guns, to help them further dominate their rivals. So both sides were trying to use the other to their advantage. Of course, once the English started showing up in larger numbers, they got more aggressive because they're English. So here we have the English in one of the nearby villages. And this is the current site of Jamestown. Obviously, it wasn't partially in the ocean when they built it. We've lost some of the shoreline over the years. But you can still go there today, and it's more of an archaeological dig now than anything else, because I mean it was all made of wood. There isn't anything left that you can see, but there are places where they've dug down. I'm pointing with my hand. I keep forgetting this is the online part. But there are places you can go where they've dug down and you can see like where the buildings used to be. But it's still like the worst in terms of like that mixture of the weird like hard-packed dirt with sand on top and mosquitoes everywhere. Like it's forest, but also sand and 100% swamp mosquitoes. It's terrible. It's like why would they do this? I mean, this is also like further inland. They've got like Colonial. I think it's Colonial Williamsburg. No, that's. I'm maybe thinking the wrong place. They've got like a recreation of what Jamestown looked like. Fully built a bit further inland, away from the mosquitoes. But yeah, it's not very big compared to the Powhatan Confederacy, which was huge. It was, most of eastern Maryland. Okay. Before I bring up the next slide, obviously the English are there to make money. They're not finding gold laying around like the Spanish were. And there are certainly animals in Tennessee. Jeez, Riley, come on. In Virginia. But it's not like Canada where there's, minks and beavers and elk and stuff. So the fur trade isn't quite where they're able to go. So what is the way they're able to make money in Virginia? And I'll give you a hint. They're still doing it. There's still a pretty big section of not just Virginia, but like the whole Southeast that still uses this to make money. So what would be something they could do in the 1600s that would still be viable today, that makes sense in like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina? Yes. So but one particular crop, not cotton, we're not quite there yet. This 100% something you've seen going down the road. Absolutely. Absolutely tobacco. Yeah, so fighting the natives weren't going to make the the English any money because, again, they didn't have like cities made of gold. So there was this type of tobacco called Orinoco tobacco that had been growing in the West Indies in South America that was becoming quite popular in Europe. So John Rolfe was like, hey, it's swampy and gross here in Virginia, just like it is in the Caribbean and South America. Maybe we could grow it here. So he started experimenting with it in 1612, and within 2 years, yeah, it caught on, and it was growing really well in Virginia. I've got pictures of Orinoco, or a picture of Orinoco tobacco. It's very wimpy compared to modern day tobacco, but it's the same idea. Now, needless to say, as they start growing more and more of this tobacco in Jamestown, the Virginia company starts sending more money and people to Jamestown to continue building this tobacco industry so that they can continue making more money. So, just to end again, unless I say, boy, guys, this is an important year, don't worry about the years. I'm just using this to show you how quickly things progressed. So in 1615, there was about 2,000 pounds of tobacco being exported, which isn't a lot. I mean, it's literally a ton, but over the course of a year, it's not that much. Within 5 years, it had jumped to 40,000 pounds. And again, I'm not going to make you guys remember these numbers. This is just to show you. And by 1629, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco were coming from the colonies. So within 15 years of it starting out, it had really exploded. Unfortunately, in order to farm, you need land, and the people who have the land don't appreciate their land being taken from them. That's just kind of a pretty brute fact of human psyche. Just look at all the wars in Europe. It's not well, these natives won't give us their land. It's like, you wouldn't give up your land? Don't be an asshole. Anyway, 1614, Powhatan was really seeing the writing on the wall and made one final attempt at an alliance with the English settlers by marrying his daughter Pocahontas to John Rolfe, as John Rolfe was like the main English guy. She converted Christianity, took the name Rebecca, traveled to England 2 years later with their infant son, but then almost immediately died from disease because, well, England's gross. But also, like, she was a Native American, and they're not real good with English diseases. So traveling to England probably wasn't a great idea. Rolfe returned to Virginia to continue working on tobacco cultivation, and this was around the time that Powhatan died and left his brother Opechancanough, I think is how it's I'm not entirely sure how that's pronounced. His brother was in charge, and his brother was far less lenient with the English settlers, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. If you've ever seen tobacco being harvested, it hasn't changed much over the years. It's just that you just pick the tobacco and put it in a cart. It's just slightly modernized now. This is what the Orinoco tobacco looks like. Again, this is at the Jamestown recreation. It's a lot smaller. It's the leaves are way thinner. It's not those. It's not the huge, like shiny leaves that you see in the tobacco fields. Just going down any, I would say, side roads, but just between here and Florence, there's fields of all sorts of stuff. So, yeah. And then they hang them up to dry before it's either ground up or just rolled. Which this stuff you just roll it up to. Well, you roll it up for cigarettes, or you grind it up for pipes, because a lot of it was pipes back then. Cigarettes were a newer thing. It's Marriage of Pocahontas, and then I believe this was Opechancanough. He was depicted as being like 8 feet tall. Oh. Alright, let's do a little bit more with Virginia here before we move to the next section. So, 1619. This is an important step. The English crown granted Virginia the right to establish their own governing body, the House of Burgesses, which is kind of sort of like a local parliament type thing. They're still under the oversight of the crown, but they can kind of do their own thing locally. Because, again, it takes like a month to get from England to North America and a month to get back. So any sort of like big decision would take forever. So there were lots and lots of new colonists pouring in. Many were too poor to pay their debts, so they were indentured servants. And as I told you guys before, the indentured servants had to work typically 7 years. Sometimes the contract would be different, in order to pay off this debt, and then on paper be given land and tools and enough money to start out. This was also the year that the first boatload of 20 Africans arrived in Jamestown aboard a Dutch ship as indentured servants. So we're not quite to African slavery yet, but we're getting there. Because, again, technically, they were indentured servants. So they would work a set number of years, and then they would be given plot of land, tools, yada, yada, yada. But the thing about indentured servitude, it was not like an employment contract. Indentured servants had very few rights, if any. And one of the tactics for the person who held the contract of the indentured servant was, once they had like a year left or a few months left, you worked that indentured servant literally to death. And it's like, oh, well, they died while their contract was still good, so I guess it's null and void now. Oh well. And I mean, abuses and all sorts that was very common. So like, when you say indentured servant, it's not technically a slave, but only in regards to there is a time limit. But in terms of how they're treated, not very different. So as we said, all this farming requires land, and Chief Opechancanough was not very chill with the English. March of 1622, he organized this huge raid on the English, killing a third of the population, which feel like number-wise probably wasn't that huge, but percentage-wise is devastating. Now, rather than the English getting up and leaving, the English being the English retaliated in pretty aggressive force. They claimed victory by, quote, right of war. That was how it was spelled back then. By 1623, but hostilities continued for nearly a decade because, claiming victory but continuing to fight for a decade, that would never happen. So the next year, King James annulled the charter and made Virginia a royal colony, which is to say, he felt like they couldn't handle themselves because, well, they've been fighting these natives for several years, even after claiming that they had won. And by making them a royal colony, they were tied more closely with the crown. So while they still technically did have the House of Burgesses, the House of Burgesses was under a Privy Council, which was run by nobles from England. So while Virginia could still do its own thing, if the Privy Council said otherwise, they had to follow what the Privy Council said. They also had to pay their taxes directly to the Church of England, which was normal for England, because the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is just a branch of the British government at this point. And this would be the model of royal colonies going forward. So anytime we talk about royal colonies, this is how it's set up. They can have their own little local court or whatever, which is all well and good, but there's going to be a Privy Council over that, and if the Privy Council says no, then nothing that the colony does matters. Uh, 1644, there was another uprising among the natives. 500 English colonists were killed. Though within 2 years, Opechancanough was captured and killed himself. And by this point, too many English had arrived to simply wipe out. So the Chesapeake natives submitted to the English and paid tribute to remain on the land that they had been on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, because that's how the English do things. They show up, they murder a bunch of people, and then you have to pay them for the pleasure of continuing to live. Okay, let's at least get to this next section so we can be where I want us to be for next time. Alright, so this is the Dutch bringing in the African, quote, indentured servants, and the big raid by Opechancanough and his tribesmen. This is one of those big pieces that starts to lose its impact the more you look at it and kind of gets darkly humorous. You have the really obvious, oh, this guy is murdering a mother and her child. You also have the same thing going on here. You've got people getting chased and killed back there, and there's stuff happening back here. But it's obvious that it was painted. How should I put it? Like, I don't know how much planning was put into it, because over here, like, the largest character in the painting is just a dude chopping wood about to get, like, stealth killed, while there's a guy over here presumably screaming about to get stabbed in the face, but he's just, like, hanging out. So, like, I feel like whoever did this part of the painting was not in communication with whoever did this part. Or if it was just one guy who did it, this part was thought out before this part. So, yeah, I just find that amusing. It's weird. And then also, like, they're having, like, a full course dinner outside. I don't know. The guy over here, like, it's like this guy materialized, throwing this guy off the table. He's like, oh, yeah. It's just, I don't know. These big dramatic paintings are always kind of weird. There's Virginia, again from the east, so looking west. All right. So, um, despite all of that, Virginia colony was becoming very, very prosperous. Had 40 to 50,000 new immigrants coming from Europe to settle in Virginia and Maryland. Unlike what we saw with, up in Canada, where there was, from the sounds of it, like a few dozen people, maybe a few hundred. We've got huge numbers here in the English colonies. Speaking of Maryland, it was founded by Charles Calvert. He was given the title Lord Baltimore by King Charles I. The thing about Calvert is that he was a Catholic Englishman, which was not the norm. But he specifically wanted a place to create a colony for Catholics, because Catholics were very much a minority in England. They were seen as, like, there's no simple way to put it. They were seen as traitors to England, whether you were politically involved or not. If you were Catholic, you were automatically suspect. I mean, like, I think it was, this is Charles I. So, like, his wife, he had a Catholic wife, and there was, like, assassination plots against his wife because they thought she was a spy, and it's like, dude, don't, what the hell? Anyway, we'll get to that later. Whoa, now. So, the colony did succeed early on. They built St. Mary's City at the mouth of the Potomac, which apparently is where everybody's building stuff. Obviously, it's called St. Mary's City because they're freaking Catholics. However, it was headed by a largely Catholic aristocracy, but the majority of the population was Protestant, because most of England was Protestant. So if you're going to have a bunch of English people coming to a colony to work, they're not going to be Catholic. So we've got this colony now where most of the aristocracy that are running the show are Catholic, and the majority of the population are Protestant, who are used to being the ones in charge back in England. That's automatically a recipe for disaster. Like, you're like days away from a violent uprising. So to make sure this didn't happen, the governor, who was Calvert's brother Leonard, passed the Act of Religious Toleration, where Maryland would have religious freedom as long as you were Christian. Even though it was run by Catholics technically, the Protestants weren't like an oppressed group. because that's how things usually went. If one side had power, the other side were immediately oppressed. Um, but Calvert knew pretty early on, hey, this. I'm looking at the numbers here, and this is looking like a situation where we're going to get killed. So let's fix this early. So, good on Calvert. This is all well and good, but hey, they've got to make some money, which is to say, growing tobacco. And well, you got to take land, but you've also got to work the land. Most laborers were poor English and Irish laborers brought over as indentured servants, as we mentioned. However, because of how much this brain fart, how big the tobacco market is expanding, they're having to bring in more African indentured servants to supplement the English and Irish. I mean, they're literally running out of poor English and Irish to drag over to work, which was something the English have never experienced before. There was always poor people to make do their work. By 1660, fewer English were even willing to cross the Atlantic. So the Virginia House of Burgesses decided to fix that by passing a law that allowed African laborers to just be enslaved. We'll just pass a law and make it so that these people that we brought over by force anyway, as indentured servants, we'll just take that time limit off. And in 1664, Maryland did the same. Just, Now, this wasn't entirely just at the drop of a hat. The example was set down in Barbados. They had grown sugar down in Barbados for a long time, and growing and refining sugar was a nightmare. It was very, very physically demanding, especially the refinement process. To put it bluntly, it would kill you. This was literally they work people to death situation. And so in Barbados, you couldn't do a indentured servitude thing. You couldn't even pretend to give the people working there rights. So they did just straight up chattel slavery. The people were brought in, worked until they died, and then they brought more people in. They were chattel slaves. They were treated like livestock. And up in Virginia and Maryland, they're like, well, if we're doing it in Barbados, which was an English colony, it's like, well, why don't we just do it here? It'll solve a lot of issues we've got. And actually, and again, I'm not trying to paint levels of how bad slavery was, but it was even worse down in Brazil, where they were mining for silver, because that apparently killed people in even greater numbers. I've got a map somewhere, I might have it a little bit later, where there's an arrow that comes in showing all the people brought from Africa, and it splits, and half of it goes to Brazil. And then the remaining, nearly 75% of the remaining arrow goes to the Caribbean, and then the little sliver goes up to North America. So much of the people brought from Africa went to Brazil to just die because of the working conditions there. I mean, and also in the Caribbean. So anyway, here's Calvert, And his brother Leonard. And this is all I could find for St. Mary's City. I'm assuming this is probably like St. Mary's Church in Maryland. I don't know what this is. Where's the mouse? It looks like a place where you park your horse before going in. I don't know. There's a sign here, so I'm assuming that like when you're walking by, you can read about it. But I wasn't able to find what it said. I wasn't looking too deep into it, but I don't know. Anyway, found that. And there, of course. Hey, these people look slightly different from us. Let's treat them like animals. Great, thanks, awesome. And besides, like, images, I did get a photograph from, this would be the 1800s because photography wasn't a thing until then. But these, I feel, are important to give humanity to a group that were often so terribly dehumanized by history. Because, of course you've got, well, actually, I'm going to go back real quick. Because, most of the time you've got these portraits that are just like dudes' faces. Or images like this, which at least this is a more sympathetic image. But these are actual people. Were 150 years ago. These were flesh and blood people. Now some of them, are posing and they're a bit more stoic in how they look. But like, where's the little scamp? There's this kid here that is clearly moving around. He's just a blur, and she's laughing at him. Very humanizing. Just this small moment of humor in what is still a situation of slavery. Because they're just human. They're people like everyone else. So I like being able to find little images like this, because the past is often, well, like I said, dates and numbers and all of this, and I like to try to bring some humanity to it. All right, one more. I think this is the last one. Bacon's Rebellion. No, two more. Let's try to get these two done in the last 15 minutes. So the reason for, well, one of the reasons for these slavery laws was to separate African laborers from European ones, because there was some level of class solidarity happening between the indentured servants, regardless of race, and the higher-ups couldn't have that. Because, as I said, indentured servants were mistreated in the same way we think of, like, slavery in North America. It was just, there was a time limit on it. So if you did make your way through the indentured servitude, once again, on paper, plot of land, tools, usually like a cow, and enough money to get started. That was, it was meant to be like scaled with the economy, but it never did. So you got the plot of land, tools, cow, and amount of money to get started from like the 1400s. So yeah, the people who made it out had nothing, essentially. So they would head west to try to start a new life. They'd run into natives that were pissed off because of, well, the English. And then when they tried to contact the government to help them out, the government didn't care. So, just shit all around. So it was in this situation that Bacon's Rebellion started. 1674, frontier settlers attacked nearby native villages. um, which just so happened to be allied with the English, which of course the natives attacked these frontiersmen back, because that's what you do. So the governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley, refused to intervene because, well, these natives were allied with the English, so obviously he's not going to send troops to attack the natives that you guys attacked first. So Nathaniel Bacon, who, by the way, just to add a little more drama to it, was related to Berkeley by marriage. Just throwing that in there. Formed a militia of planters, frontiersmen, and laborers, both black and white, who attacked natives regardless of their affiliation. Berkeley declared Bacon guilty of treason, and so they responded by heading to Jamestown. And when you have a militia heading to a city, that's never a good thing. That said, though, they weren't just heading to Jamestown to burn it down, which they kind of did later eventually. But their wives, the so-called newswives, were already there spreading information and rumors about the mistreatment of the workers. And by the time they arrived, their supporters had won the House of Burgesses and were pretty much on their side. So they marched across the countryside, burned down plantations, including Berkeley's, and the governor fled across the Chesapeake Bay. So, hey, rebellion won. Except Bacon died of dysentery the next month. The movement was crushed, and the landowners who worked with them had their plantations plundered. Whoops. But the important part of this is here. Berkeley saw that the disenfranchised white laborers were willing to work with their black counterparts because everyone was being mistreated more or less equally. So what he did, he let the white rebels return home peacefully, made their life a little better, and cracked down on the black rebels to divide these laborers along racial lines. Make sure that they were angry at each other rather than coming together to understand that it was not a racial divide, it was a class divide. But, you know, can't have that. That sounds like communism. And then King Charles II chartered the Royal African Company in 1672 to carry African slaves to North America, so they didn't even have to go to the Dutch anymore. So yeah, we are, and by we I mean the English colonies, 100% in the African slave trade now. Which, I mean, I feel like if you're getting slaves at all, you're in the slave trade. But now we're not even, like, buying them from the Dutch. But this is important for later, for when the British decide to have a conscience about it and decide, okay, no more slave trade. And since they control the ocean, there was no more slave trade. Like, hey, we're not transporting people across the ocean anymore. And America, which was independent at that time, which still had slavery, were like, well, I guess we're not getting any more slaves. We got to hold on to the ones we got. So anyway, frontiersmen. I think this one's actually from Europe, but I do like the image here of, like, you've got the father and mother working, you've got the son, and you've got the baby you don't want to leave the child inside, they'll set the house on fire. So just tie them up and put them in a tree. That sounds terrible. Put them in a hammock in the tree, I guess. I don't know. I would just tie the child to the tree branch because they'll fall out of the hammock. But that's just me. There's Jamestown. There's Jamestown. There's Bacon and his lads. I like how it's kind of set up like the Me and the Boys meme. Me and the Boys burning down Jamestown. All right, one more. So tobacco was making England all kinds of money, but European investors were always looking to diversify because, well, they weren't dumb. They knew that eventually the market would, if not crash, at least sag, and the prices for tobacco would drop, and there would be something else, some other commodity that would be good. So they looked to the West Indies. The English, Dutch, and French already had colonies. Let's see, The English had put permanent settlements in St. Christopher, Barbados, and Nevis. Barbados was their big one. They had tobacco, cotton, and livestock there. Dutch had St. Martin and Curacao, but they weren't able to really do much in terms of growing stuff, so they mostly just shipped goods between other empires, because they still had a lot of boats out in the ocean, so that worked out. The French had Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint Dominique, but they had a lot of angry natives on their islands, so they spent most of their time fighting the natives and not really getting anything done. And of course the Spanish were there, but the Spanish were too busy being a ruined country, so they didn't quite work out. Right. So, I've already mentioned this, but we'll see who remembers. With tobacco potentially losing its value, what were they going to make their money on in the Caribbean? Was going to be the big crop down in the Caribbean. I did mention this when I talked about Barbados. Grows really well in very hot climates, very humid climates. I mean, technically, it grows, at least in the lowlands around here. I remember my sister brought one home and had it in her room for like years. Actually, I don't think I think you could grow it not. I want to say maybe even around here. Usually it's more coastal, but makes a lot of money. No guesses from anybody? I mean, you're not going to get any points off of anything if you're wrong. Close. Indigo was one of the big ones, especially here in South Carolina. Indigo and rice were two of the big ones, but those aren't quite what we're looking for. Not quite corn. That was, I don't think corn ever quite got to cash crop status. Maybe later when they were like doing an industrial level. Sugarcane. Yeah. So sugarcane has been grown in the Caribbean. The thing about it though is it required expensive equipment, quite a lot of technical know-how and a lot of labor. Um, it also had to be shipped to Europe for the final refinement. So it wasn't just like with tobacco where you could just grow it and then you try it out and it's done. Um, it took a lot of like initial investment to get started, but it made so much money. Um, Dutch partnered with the English to establish sugar plantations and mills in Barbados, um, which transformed the economic and political landscape, not just the Caribbean, but North America, because, as I said, the process of cultivating, harvesting, and refining the sugar cane would literally kill the workers. So this resulted in an extremely high amount of slaves being brought in, and the emergence of chattel slavery in North America, which made its way not just from the Caribbean, but into North America. The Dutch had sugarcane cultivation from the Portuguese in Brazil, which, as I said, Brazil was really bad. They had the best refineries in Europe, but they needed colony space for the actual sugarcane, which the British had. And again, oh, actually, no, this is the first time I mentioned this. South Carolina was not settled by people coming over from Britain. They were settled by people from Barbados, which technically Barbados was a British colony, but they were going along the east coast of America and were like, hey, this land's swampy and horrible, just like Barbados. Let's grow stuff here. So that's why we've got like indigo and rice and that sort of stuff in lowland South Carolina. Real quick before I let you guys go, I know we're right here at the last minute. Also, here's everybody in their islands and stuff. Do you know what two things you can make from sugarcane, specifically sugarcane? Well, you can make one thing from it, and then you can make that thing into something else. And they're pretty central to like the Caribbean culture. Well, what do you get when you heat up sugar a lot? When you melt sugar? What do you know what you would call that when it's sugar cane, though? So, like it's an old-timey word for basically syrup. Molasses. Do you know what you can get from molasses? Think Caribbean. You might not know this connection because it shocked me the first time I heard it. You can ferment molasses into rum. Yeah. So sugarcane was super important. So yeah, that'll do it. We're right where I want us to be. Note-wise, we'll get into the Pilgrims and Puritans next time. I'll see y'all next week. Yeah, today's Wednesday. All right. Y'all have a good one.